Text me on the WhatsApp.
Okay. So the Mishnah had said we were discussing the distinction between Hegdish and Truma. We had mentioned potentially 11 different categories of chumras that exist in Hegdish that don't exist by Truma when it comes to Tuma and Tahara. We had spent a very long time discussing Kli b'Seid Kli. We've moved on from that. Now we've moved on to the next din, which is Achorayim v'Soch. It said in the Mishnah that when it comes to a Kli that becomes into contact with Tuma, the Kli will not become Tameh entirely on the inside of the Kli unless something falls onto the inside of the Kli. If it falls onto the outside of the Kli, then only the outside of the Kli is Tameh, the inside of the Kli is not. Now this is important to remember. We said before, remember, Tuma works in sort of every time it transfers, it drops a level, right? So we said that what things are susceptible to Tuma? It can either be Adam, a person, Kalim, vessels, or Ochlin and Mashkim. We have been discussing Ochlin and Mashkim at length. But here we're discussing Kalim, and when it comes to Kalim and Adam are the same. They can only become Tameh when they're come into contact with an Av HaTumah, right? Because they can only be a Rishon. They cannot become a Sheni. Since they can't become a Sheni, if they come into contact with a Rishon, nothing happens to it. So what are we discussing here in the Mishnah? We're only discussing a Tumah Derabanan. And what we mean is that if, let's say, a Tumah, let's say we're talking about a Keli becoming a Tameh, it can't become a Sheni. So the context over here that we're discussing is to be talking about a Kli that is to begin with only becoming Tameh Midirabanan. And so since the Tumah is only Derabanan, the question is under what circumstances did the rabbis make it Tameh and when did they not make it Tameh? So what we're basically saying is as follows. If the Tumah touches the outside of the Kli, then we'll say that only the outside of the Kli is Tameh, but the inside is not. If it touches the inside of the Kli, we're going to see in a moment, it becomes Tameh not only for the inside, but for the whole thing. This distinction that the Tumah only goes on the outside and on the inside was only said by Hegdish. Says the Gemara, "My achorayim v'soch." What does it mean when we're referring to the achorayim, the outside, v'soch? What's the inside? Kedetanan, like the Mishnah says, and this is just going to be an expression of this. Din kli shenitma achorav b'mashkin. If let's say you have a kli that the outside of the kli became tamei b'mashkin, and
Sorry,
it's okay, and the kli becomes tamei because mashkin again, it's a din derabanan. Then achorav tamein. What's the question?
what is it?
Okay, so I didn't go too much into the detail of it, but specifically here, there's a unique halacha when it comes to mashke. When it comes to mashke, normally the halacha is that mashke is no different than anything else. Me'ikar hadin, though, let's say you have a zav spit. The spit of a zav is no different than the zav himself. So whereas normally if a zav touches something, that thing becomes a rishon, his spit is also called an afatuma. So if he spits on something, let's say a kli, now all of a sudden that kli can become a rishon l'tumah. Right, so now we're not discussing the case of spit, but since the liquid of a zav makes a kli a rishon, now what we're saying is any liquid that touches the kli is like exera derabanan to the liquid of spit, and so therefore they made it din derabanan. This din derabanan only applies when it touches the outside, not when it touches the inside. It says the brisa, like it says in the Mishnah, a different Mishnah, kli shnitma achorav b'mashkin, achorav tamein. The outside is tamei, however socho, the inside ugno, it's rim, ozno, it's handle. The yadav, let's say like the other type of handle, let's say for a pot and a pan, tahirin, then it's tahar because again it didn't get onto the inside. However, nitma soicha, if the inside of the kli, let's say it's a coffee mug, and the inside of the coffee mug has a little bit of coffee that's tamei, that's not going to make the kli tamei. The kli is going to remain tahar. But if it goes on the inside of the kli, then kulei tamei, everything's going to be tamei. The Mishnah also said that in that case, that not only the achorav and the soch, when there's a distinction, it also referred to something called the Beis Hatzvita. Beis Hatzvita wasn't clearly defined. So the rabbi is correct. My Beis Hatzvita. What does Beis Hatzvita mean? So says the Gemara, Reviewed Shmuel, Makom Shetzovta. It's the place you would hold on to it when you're passing it. So let's say there's a certain type of kli where there was an area on the actual vessel that you would use your fingers to hold on to it to pass it back and forth. Maybe it's a handle. And he bases that off the pasuk in Rus where it says V'yitzbat lo kali, that he passed over to her some like roasted corn, and therefore you see the lashon of vayitzbat is tzvita. He says this is like the place where there was a certain type of kli. Like I don't know about you, and I have French fries, which I don't eat anymore, but if I were to eat French fries and dip them into ketchup, I would just stick it on the side of my plate. Some people they don't like their plate to get all messy, so they have a little special thing on the side of their plate where they put the ketchup over there, they take the fry. They're a little bit more feminine and they don't want to make a mess on their plate. So these types of people, he says, some kalim had a little special area that you put all your mustards and your ketchups and all your condiments in it. That place you can also use it to grab from. They're really sort of saying the same thing. The only machlekes is what's the gears in the Mishnah. Is the gears in the Mishnah tzvita or tzvia? So if the gears is tzvita, then the explanation is like the first one. And if the gears in the Mishnah is tzvia, then it's like the second one here. It's the mokum shenikiye hadas. So you've in means to dip. Okay. Tani Rabbi Kamed Rav Nachman. He taught the following brisa. Kol kalim, all kalim. They don't have this halacha of our Mishnah where we make a distinction between if the tumah only comes on the outside versus coming on the inside. And this is true. Echad kadshe hamikdash ve'echad kadshe hagvul. This applies, it seems, to all types of kachim, which again fits our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said that din, where there's going to be a tumah, is only by kodesh. So says the Gemara. One second. What does it mean over here when it says kadshe hagvul? The first part of kachim makes sense. Echad kadshe hamikdash. What's kadshe hagvul? I'm like kadshe hagvul mainin. What is it referring to? Truma? Are you telling me it's truma? It can't be. Says the Gemara. V'hatnan. There's a Mishnah. Our Mishnah. Acharayim v'sochu beisat tzvita l'truma is going to be okay, and for hegdish it's going to be a problem. So you see that for truma, there's no problem if the tumah touches on the outside. It's not going to be mitam on the inside. That's only true by hegdish. The Gemara says dilma l'chulin. Maybe we're talking about that unique scenario of a person who treats his chulin like hegdish, and he treats it so that it'll even have a sheni, a shlishi, even a revi'i, no different than hegdish. So that's slightly different. In which case, says the Gemara, at kartan milsa. You know what? That's a very good pshat you just said, and that's exactly the pshat in the Mishnah. Damar Rabba Baravua, achat esrei ma'alos shanukan. Like we said earlier, that our Mishnah is listing 11 items. The first 6 of which, sheish rishonos, apply to both actual hegdish bein lekodesh, bein lechulin shenasu al taras hakodesh, and to chulin that someone treats like hegdish. So therefore, achronos, whereas the last 5, those are only referring to kodesh, avalo lechulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. In which case, what we're saying in this, even for chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. Okay, says the Gemara Weiler. It said in the Mishnah, the third case, it's hanose as hametris. Let's just clarify again the case. What are we talking about? We're talking about a person who is holding in his hand a medras. What's medras? It's actually, it's funny. Mattress. Okay, so let's just quickly remind ourselves. Now for the rabbi, for some of that. So there's a type of tumah. So you have a nida, you have a zav. These are various different people that are inherently tummy because of something that happened to them. Some of these types of people have a unique halacha that if they put any weight on some item, an item that is normally put weight on, so a shoe, they're normally walking on it, normally has weight on it, a cushion on a chair, they would normally sit on it, a mattress on a bed, or a bed itself, anything that they would be using as a support for their body, for their walking, whatever it is, if they use it while they're tamei, nida, zav, zava, whatever it is, then there's a unique halacha that although normally if I'm a rishon, I can make this thing a sheni, and this thing can make that a shlishi. Medras, tumas medras, this special type of tumah, it doesn't drop a level. So if it zav sits on a mattress or walks in a pair of shoes, the shoes are also an av. So he's an av, that thing's an av also.
That's a rabbar?
No, that's a din deraisa. That is a special din in tumas medras learned out from sukkim, and therefore one has to be conscious that if a person, that's why we discussed earlier in the Gemara, Nida, who her clothing that she's wearing or that she's sitting on, a Nida, who is an avatama, who sits on a mattress or sits on a pile of clothing, all the clothing becomes an avatama, which means now he can go and touch something and make it a rishon. So what if you have someone is holding in his hands the shoe or the mattress, the pillow of a zav or a Nida? So what you're holding in your hand is an avatama, makes you a rishon automatically. And what if in your hand you're also holding a kli? And in that kli is truma or hegdish, right? So do we say that the avatuma that's in your hand makes you a rishon? If you're a rishon, well, you can't make a kli tameh. A kli can't become a sheni. So what's the big deal? No big deal, right? So the concern is like this. The concern is what happens if... Yeah.
What's the concern?
I just want to take the honor.
Yeah, take
Give it to me. Go on.
Yeah.
What's the
No one's
concern?
taking it. Go ahead.
Yeah, take it.
There you go. Okay, so
This is going to stay in the shul. That's it.
Yeah.
perfect. So the concern is as follows. With a regular kli, like a metal kli, there's no concern. Why? Because you cannot make the kli a sheni. So there's no issue. The only issue would be if maybe if I took one hand holding the av and I took the av and I touched it to the thing. Now, there's an interesting halacha. Although, theoretically speaking, it makes me a Rishon and I can make it a Sheni, if I'm holding them at the same time, right, then what that's called Tumas Chiburin, we don't view me as a separate step. It's like I'm connected. So therefore, this Av can make that a Rishon. But that's not a question. Everyone agrees to that. That's no question. So what are we talking about over here? We're talking about a Kli Cheres. Kli Cheres is an earthenware pot. An earthenware pot cannot become Tameh through touch. Therefore, even though I'm holding it while I'm holding this Avatuma, it stops here. Remember what we said yesterday, there's a force field on the Kli Cheres. It's Chotes. So therefore, anything that's inside of it, and it in of itself does not become Tameh. However, so Minat Torah, this Kli Cheres is not Tameh. Because even though I'm Rishon and the thing I'm holding is an Av, and even though I'm holding it at the same time, but it's not going to touch. However, what happens if I take my hand and I accidentally let it drop into the airspace of this Kli? Then the Kli becomes Tameh. This is obvious, right? And that's not a Din Darabanan. That is Me'ikar Hadid. So, says our Mishnah, if I'm exactly in this situation, I'm walking holding, I don't know, the shoe of a Zav. No. I'm holding the shoe of a Zav, which is an Avat. Yeah. It could be a Sheretz also, theoretically, I guess. But I'm saying, right. But I think it is a Chumah specifically by Medrash. Okay. Yeah. So I'm holding this thing, and as long as I don't let it go in, I think we're good to go. That's Kli Cheres. But let's say if I dip it in a little bit, then it's going to become Tameh, and everything that's inside of it's going to become Tameh if it's Truma, because if it's a Sheni, then the Truma becomes a Shlishi, no problem. So the question is like this: am I even allowed to do this thing? So says the Mishnah, you're allowed to if what you're carrying and transporting in the Kli Cheres is Truma, but if what you're transporting is Hegdish, you're not allowed to. The question is going to be why. So says the Gemara.
Then we compare Chulin to Hegdish?
What's the question?
I'm saying, if you're saying that's...
It's a higher level. Hegdish is a higher level.
Hegdish is a higher level than Truma than Chulin. So what we're saying over here is, Chulin you can certainly transport. You can even transport Truma in this Kli Cheres. Because again, remember, Meikar Din, there's nothing wrong with this. Because again, the Kli Cheres is remember what we said, if you stick it in the ceiling, it's like a force field. So if it's force field, you should be good to go. So says the Gemara like this. So for Hegdish, you're not allowed to transport it. So, and it's an important point here. Does it say in the Mishnah that if you did transport it, it's Tameh? No, it does not say that. It says you cannot transport it. It says like this. What does it say in the Mishnah? It says, Hanose as medras, a person who carries medras in one hand, let's say the shoe of a Zav, Nose as truma, is allowed to carry the Kli Cheres holding Truma, Avalo as HaKodesh, he can't carry Hegdish. Does that mean if he carried Hegdish, the Hegdish becomes Tameh? Or does it just simply mean don't do it? But if you did it, it's okay. We'll get to that in the Gemara. It says the Gemara Weiler. Hanose as medras, nose as truma, avalo as hegdish, kodesh my time alone. Why is this din even true? Why is it true that I'm not allowed to carry kodesh inside this Kli Cheres on the one side and on the other side while I'm holding tumas medras? What's the reason for the din? So somebody messed up. Says the Gemara. Mishum Ma'aser Shahaya. The whole entire Gzeira is because of a story that happened. There was a story once. What's the story? Dam Rav Yehuda Mashmoli told over the following Ma'aser, and this Ma'aser became the reason why we made a din, the Rabbanan, that it should be ushered specifically by Hegdish. Ma'aser be'echad shahaya ma'avir chavis shal yayin kodesh mimakom lamakom. So let's work this out. You have a person who's traveling on the way. He himself is a zav, so he's an avatuma, right? He's an avatuma, or he's a regular person holding an avatuma. That's probably a better way to say it. You have a regular person who is not a zav. Let's say it this way. He's a shahaya ma'avir chavis. He's holding a barrel, and we'll assume the chavis is made of cheres, right?
The other hand.
And he's holding it. Right now, all he's doing is holding the cheres. Right now, he's just walking. He's holding the cheres.
Okay. He's
holding it, and it's filled with wine. And the yayin is kodesh. It's going to be used for nesachim in the Beis Hamikdash. And he's mimakum lamakum, and he's traveling. Says the Gemara.
His shoelace breaks.
V'nifsaka ritzua shel sandaloi, and his shoelace breaks. And all of a sudden, different shadows over here. So you have to remember, he's a zav, okay? And remember, so let's just work it out. If he's a zav and he's transporting a Kli Cheres, he cannot make the Kli Cheres tameh, because again, Kli Cheres is a force field. So touching the Kli Cheres is no big deal. If he sticks his finger in the wine, massive problems. But I'm saying, as long as he's not, if he's all he's doing is holding it. But now what he does is his shoe strap breaks. He goes down to take his shoe off, or he goes down and grabs the shoelace. Different opinions. But the point is, what is he grabbing? He's grabbing something that is a medras. It's an avatuma. It's his shoe, basically. He takes it v'nifsaka ritzua shel sandalai v'notla v'hinicha al pi chavis, and he puts it on top of the chavis to rest it on the top of the chavis for a second. Maybe he needs to, I don't know, do something else for a second. He leaves it there, and nebach v'nafla la'avir chavis, and he didn't realize it dipped down inside the halal, inside the space of the chavis, which is now a problem. Now you have an avatom of a medras that is inside the airspace, inside the chavis, inside the bucket that has the wine that's hegdish, which means that now the kli is becoming a rishon, and if the kli is a rishon, then the things inside is going to be mamish tamei. It's tamei as a sheni. It would be tamei even if it's truma. But what's the story here? He's taking hegdish to the Beis Hamikdash, v'nitmeis, and he was matamet. And from that moment, what did they decide? They said, from this story you see, and then, so he arrives at the Beis Hamikdash. He tells them the story, right? And they say, oh, all of the wine that we were going to be using for the nesachim, you just completely ruined. In order to not have this problem in the future, so that hegdish isn't messed up. But in that moment, they made the following din. A person, our din of our Mishnah, a person carries the medras in one hand, and truma, he can carry truma. However, now, this story sounds like a story that there really shouldn't be a difference between truma and hegdish. Meaning, if there's a problem that we're nervous, what are we saying? We're nervous your shoe's gonna break. You're gonna take the shoelace, you're gonna stick it onto the top of the kli, and it's gonna fall in a little bit. Well, that's gonna make that kli a rishon, which would affect truma and it would affect hegdish. So why is it limited to hegdish? Asked the Gemara. Ihachi truma nami. Yeah. So Gemara says no. I'll explain why. Hamani, who is the author of this din, our Mishnah? We're gonna say it's the author of a brisa later on, and that brisa is going to tell us the following yesod. Whenever we make a gzeira d'Rabbanan from a maisa, we limit it to the exact scenario of the maisa. So even if there's a logical reason to expand it, we don't. Now, this is not true in general for din d'Rabbanan. Din d'Rabbanan, we say something called lo plug. We generally not expand it. We generally say that if the rabbi said, for instance, don't swim because you might make a boat, well, I'm not going to make a boat in my pool. Lo plug, doesn't matter. You can't swim on Shabbos, you can't swim on Shabbos. I can't ride a horse because I'm going to grab a branch, but there's no trees where I'm going. Doesn't matter. Din d'Rabbanan. That's lo plug. That's when the din d'Rabbanan comes from some sort of a logical reason they're making, some protection they're creating. They had some wisdom that goes beyond what the reason they gave us. Whereas over here, if the whole reason why we're doing it is because of a very specific story, it's almost like we're saying that really we would have never thought this could ever happen. The story tells us it happened. Well, if the story tells us it happened, we're not going to expand it beyond the story. That's going to be the opinion. And if that's the case, since the story happened with Hegdish, didn't happen with Truma, meaning had it happened with Truma, the Gzeira would have been on Truma.
This relates to what? To the Bryce?
Well, this is the din of our Mishnah. The entire din of our Mishnah, where we says
throughout all of Gemara, you're saying it's not just one.
Yes, we're taking this general rule and saying that this opinion that applies all throughout Shas is the opinion of our Mishnah, and since our Mishnah is predicated on this story, so therefore it's limited to Hegdish. So again, another example of something in our Mishnah that really it's not because of the holiness of Hegdish. It has nothing to do with holiness. Meaning, had the story happened with Ma'aser Sheni, we'd be talking about Ma'aser Sheni. It has nothing to do with the holiness of the item. It's just because again, Me'ikra din, it's not tamei. It's only that since something happened, then the shoelace fell in, and then the thing became tamei. So we said, you know what? There's no traveling, and if you carry something in one hand and the other hand, tamei if it's holding hegdish, but if it's not holding hegdish, not. Now again, this will only apply to a kli cheres. If it's talking about a regular kli, there's no concern. That's another obvious distinction. So says the Gemara, who is the author of our Mishnah? The author of our Mishnah is Rabbi Chananya ben Akavyahi. The Amar loy asru ela biyardenu besfina ubemaisa shahaya. Now it's just quoting the words he used in the other case because he limited some other case of a din d'Rabbanan only to that Maisa. And in that Maisa, they were on the Jordan River, they were in a boat. Exactly the details over there are the only thing that's usher in his case. So to over here, we're going to limit it to the exact case of a person who's walking, who is holding in one hand the kli cheres, and the other hand is of, his medras, and it's holding hegdish. But if we're holding truma, wasn't holding truma, so therefore the Maisa doesn't extend. Now ask the Gemara 1 second. You're telling me about this person, Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya. What's the story with him? What was his case? So we can understand how we're pulling from there. Says the Gemara, Maihi, what's the case? What's the din? The Tanya, the Brisa over there says the Brisa is a Brisa in Para. Right? It says like this. Lo yisa ad mechatas. Now, interestingly, when we talk about mechatas, we haven't discussed it really so much yet in our Mishnah. Mechatas is the 5th level. That's the level even above hegdish, regular normal hegdish. It's a type of hegdish. And then we'll see at the end of today's Gemara that mechatas has a lot of unique halachas. And a lot of them were because of the tzdukim. We'll get to that in a minute. So lo yisa ad mechatas. A person shouldn't carry mechatas, v'afar chatas, or the ash of the para aduma. V'avir and biyar, that he shouldn't travel on the Jordan River, ubisfina, on a boat. V'lo yamud b'tzad zeh, he shouldn't stand on one side of the Jordan River. V'yizra came l'tzad acher, and he shouldn't throw it to the other side. V'lo yishitim al pnei hamayim, if he wants to transport the mechatos, he shouldn't let it float on the water. V'lo yirkav al gabi behema, he shouldn't ride on an animal holding the mechatos. V'lo al gabi chaveira, and he shouldn't go on his friend's shoulders, unless unless the person who's carrying it has got his feet on the ground. Now again, the whole point over here, it says is if he wants to go on a bridge, he can, because then his feet are on the ground, even though technically he's in the air. Yeah.
I was going to say, how can you be on someone's shoulders if your feet aren't on the
Right,
ground?
exactly right. The ena choshesh, and you don't have to be concerned. Now I'm reading this Bryce, and I'm like, ena choshesh, what are you choshesh for? Well, what is even the concern over here? It says the Gemara, echad hayarden ve'echad shara naharais, and this first opinion holds that this din of transporting the mechatas cannot be done not only on the Jordan River, but all rivers, and not only on a boat, but even if you're swimming, even if you're floating, you must have your feet on the ground when you're transporting the chatas. Why? What's the whole story here? Rabbi Chananya ben Nakavia Omer, he says, no, I limit this halacha le'asur ela biyardin on the Jordan, ubisfina, on a boat, ukimaisa shahaya, just like the story happened. Meaning to say, Rabbi Chananya ben Nakavia is revealing to us what this entire din is predicated on, which is a din de rabbanan that was a consequence of a story. Just like our case was a din de rabbanan, which is a consequence of a story, so too over here I have a din de rabbanan as a consequence of a story. What was the story? My ma'aseh shahaya, says the Gemara. There was a certain person, he happened to be on a boat. The boat happened to be on the Jordan River, and he was transporting the mechatas. Probably he was trying to get to the Beis Hamikdash in order to be able to become tamei, tahor from his tumas mace, whatever it was. It turned out there was a small part of someone's body. They didn't realize someone had passed or whatever it was, and they found a piece of tumas mace, which we know a tumas mace is an av hatuma. Sorry, a tumas mace is an avi avos hatuma, right? And therefore, it creates an ohel. We know that if it's like the dispersion of the tumah goes throughout the entire room, which means everything on that boat, inside that chamber, whatever it was, that on the below deck was tamei. And sure enough, his mechatas, which was down there, was also tamei. And therefore, what happened? His mechatas became tamei, and this tumas mace, this tamei mace, now can't get tar from the mechatas. So ba'osa shah, from that story, what they decided, Amru lo yisa the mechatas v'avrachatas v'yavir v'yarden misfina. Says Rabbi Chananya ben Akavia, the gzeira was exactly like it was in the boat. Now the Rabbanons, they expanded slightly. They're not going to go crazy and say you can't transport it at all. They're going to compare it to the Maisa, but they'll expand it to all rivers, even not on a boat. If you're floating, if you're passing, they want your feet on the ground. Says Chananya ben Akavia, no. It's the exact details of the story, the way it happened. That is the only Isser, and therefore that opinion of Chananya ben Akavia is our Mishnah, who says that the distinction between Kodesh and Shruma is exactly because of the story where once it happened that the guy's shoelace fell in. Okay. Says the Gemara, Iboilu, 1 second. So this case, our Mishnah, the din is that if I'm traveling and I have medrus in one hand and I'm holding a kli cheres in the other one, the halacha is that I'm not supposed to do that for truma. Sorry, for hegdish, but for truma I'm allowed to do it. Ask the Gemara. That's true if, let's say, it's sandal tame. What happens if you're talking about sandal tamer mahu? Meaning to say, well, what we mean is that do we expand it even beyond that? Meaning, the story was, carrying. If I'm holding in one hand a shoe that belonged to his of. What if I'm just holding a shoe and it's similar to the case of a? The Gemara doesn't answer that question. It's a little bit of a strange question. Chavis psucha. I understand the case that you were talking about where there was a concern is where there was an open barrel. So of course there the concern was the shoelace may dip in a little bit. What if the barrel's sealed on top? So really there's no concern right now, right? Chavis sesuma mahu. What's the halach if it's stuma? Those two questions the Gemara doesn't seem to want to answer. I don't really even understand 100% what those two questions really are. But the third question is a good question. I mentioned it before. Over v'nasa ma'u. What's the halacha if a person incorrectly didn't follow the Mishnah, carried a chavis which has kodesh in it? Do we say over v'nasu ma'u? Reb Eila Amarim over v'nasa tamei. He says if you did it, it's tamei. So the Mishnah that's distinguishing between truma and kodesh isn't only telling you what the halacha is, what you should and shouldn't do. It's saying that if you did it, it's tamei. Whereas Reb Zera Amar over v'nasa tahor, the Mishnah is not telling us that it actually becomes tamei. All it's saying is you shouldn't do it because we don't want to happen to you what happened to that Maisa. But really, if you did it, we're not actually creating any tumah. Okay.
If the story is so based upon, if the halakha is based on just one story, and the story is just that specific example, what is the purpose of the Gemara showing this story if it's only related to the story as it happens?
Well,
because there's so many other stories that they were experiencing, like. What was the purpose? What is
so it's very simple.
Teaching
the din of the
another story that they didn't, like, why this story?
And I get your question. So the din of the Mishnah is specifically this case, meaning that we need to know why the din of the Mishnah is true. It's based on this story. That's why.
And why this story, not many other stories that also teach at one point that's relevant to that one situation? Right? Did they discuss?
Well, those other stories, well, at least the way we're recording it, those other stories didn't happen. Meaning the din of our Mishnah is specifically referring to a case like happened. So therefore, since I see in the Mishnah that it's tamei, or not it's tamei, that it's usher, therefore I have to find a source for why it's usher. This is the story that it happened. It's very possible that there were other stories that occurred for whatever reason they decided they didn't make a zero off of that story.
They didn't want to
that I
make
don't
that.
know. Yeah.
Okay.
But again, it assumes that those stories happened. I mean, between me and you, I'm sure it did. Okay. Either way, says the Gemara back to 2 dots. What did it say in the Mishnah? The 6th case of our Mishnah was Kalim hanigmara mitahara. So if we remember, a kli can only become tamei once the kli is completely fashioned. If it's still in the middle of it becoming formed, it cannot become tamei. But once it's formed, then it becomes tamei. So it said in the Mishnah that if you have a kli, that you're watching over it to make sure that there's no tumah, and as it's becoming fashioned, the halacha is that if you're going to use the kli for kodesh, for hegdesh, you have to drop it in a mikveh first, whereas for truma, you don't have to drop it in the mikveh. Meaning, even though you know no tumah came in contact with it.
It's good Torah.
It's completely tahar mikar adin. The midur abanan, we were matstrich, we required that if you're going to use it for hegdish, drop it in the mikveh first. That's the din of the Mishnah. Ask the Gemara. The gamrinu man, who is the person that is finishing the kli that we're discussing over here? Ilem the gamrinu chaver, we're talking about someone who's makben on tomentara, he's a chaver, he's tamad chacham. Then what's the concern? Why does it have to get dropped into a mikveh? Lama lahu tvila, it doesn't require tvila. The guy is a chaver. He knows the halachas. He's not going to let someone come into contact with the kli. So Ela de Gamrinu Amaretz, Elamai, you're going to tell me the person who's finishing the kli, he's the simple artisan, and this artisan is an Amaretz, and maybe we don't trust this Tumah and Tara. So therefore, if that's the case, then Nigmer b'Tahara Kari Lahu. How could the case of the Mishnah be that that's called Nigmer b'Tahara? We can't trust that it's Nigmer b'Tahara. He's an Amaretz. Not only that, then really there would be no reason to make a distinction between Kodesh and Truma if all it is the fact that he's an Amaretz. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabba Bar Shila, Amar Rav Masna, Amar Shmuel, La'olam de Gamrino Chaver. What are we talking about? We're talking about the Talmud Chacham. Even the Talmud Chacham. And even though the Talmud Chacham is makbin on Tumah and Tara, and therefore you don't have to be concerned that any Tumah touched it. However, Mishum Tinura Dama Oretz de Nafel, second time spit came up on today's daf. Yeah, we're talking about the spit of an Amaretz. Now, normally, an Amaretz, we don't know if he's makbin. We don't know if he's makbin. So we have to midrabanan be choshesh that he's tamei. What type of tuma midrabanan are we choshesh he's like? We treat him like a zav. Like a zav, midrabanan. We treat him like a zav, midrabanan. Now, what's the halacha by a zav? We said earlier. It was a great day. Thanks for sponsoring.
Guys, of course.
Yep. I'll put the link up if you want to listen.
Yeah.
Well,
now July, and I have the link.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. Okay. So now a zav. Remember, if a zav spits, the spit is considered like he is a part of the same zav. So since an Amaretz is treated as a zav midirabanan, the spit of an Amaretz has that same tumah midirabanan, right? So therefore, says the Gemara, what's the concern here? You have a Talmud Chacham sitting and fashioning a kli, and he's going to be talking to an Amaretz, and maybe the Amaretz is going to spit a little bit on the kli, and the spit's going to be matam of the kli. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Amos, when is this spit that is hitting the kli? If it's before the kli is finished, then who cares, right? If it's beforehand, halav mana, who it's not yet a kli. Since it's not a kli yet, it cannot become tamei. Elamai, it must be that it's already a kli. Ela pasir the gamre. So if that's the case, mizar zayir behu, isn't the Talmud Chacham going to be careful to make sure that the Amaretz he's talking to doesn't actually get any spit on him? So Gemara says, la'olam ekam de gamre. We're talking about a case where the Amaretz, who's talking or spitting, whatever it is, he's going to spit, and it's going to get some spit onto the kli before the kli is finished. We said 2 seconds ago that shouldn't help. Says the Gemara, v'dilma be'idna de gamre adayin lachahi. Meaning, he spits on it before he finishes the kli, when it's not metameh, but that spit is still moist when he finishes. And after he finishes, now you have wet spit that came from the zav derabanan, an Amaretz, and that's going to be metameh, because even though at this point in time the Talmud Chacham is going to be makbid to not let anything touch it, he wasn't makbid before when he didn't have to be concerned. So maybe the Amaretz, not intentionally, but accidentally snuck his way, got some tumah onto the kli. Now the kli becomes an actual kli, and since it's still moist, you have tumah. And therefore, says the din of the Mishnah, midirabanan, we're going to say that if you're going to be using hegdish, you're going to have to be toivel in a mikvah, whereas if you're going to be using truma, you don't have to. Says the Gemara, what do you notice in the Mishnah? That the requirement is tvila. Tvila in ha'erev shemesh aloi. So just very quickly, let's remind ourselves, there's different stages and different types of tumah. Let's talk about a zav. A zav has to wait 7 days, right? And at the end of 7 days, he goes to the mikvah. After he goes to the mikvah, on that day, before he goes to the mikvah, he can't eat anything other than chulin. Now the zav goes to the mikvah, and he does. And right now, after the mikvah, before the end of the 7th day, he's what's referred to as a tvul yom. A tvul yom could already start to eat meiser sheni. Still can't eat truma. Still can't eat hekdesh. Yeah, he's tamei. It's a light type of tumah called the tvul yom. Because really, there's nothing that he actually has to do to become tahor other than wait for nightfall. Once nightfall comes, now he goes from being a tvul yom to being a mechusar kippurim. A mechusar kippurim is a person who is allowed to have truma, but is not allowed to have hekdesh. He has to wait till tomorrow morning to wake in the morning. Now's the time for him to bring a carbon. He brings up his carbon. That's the kippurim that he needs to get. He needs to get repentance from that. He's lacking that carbon. He brings the carbon, and now after the carbon, he gets to eat from the carbon. And Shalom Al Yisrael, he's 100% back. He can go into the Beis Hamikdash, and everything's fine. So this is those are the different levels. So what are we talking about over here? We're saying over here that for this kli, which we just said that if you finished fashioning it, out of the concern that the spit of the amoritz got on it before you finished it, we're going to say that you have to be toivel in a mikvah, which is mashma that after you're toivel in a mikvah, you could immediately use it. We treat this kli after it's dropped in a mikvah the same way we would treat it like it's a regular, good, perfect, 100% good kli. Now, normally Kodesh is required. You need all the way to the next morning, right? Truma only at night and Meister Sheni by day. And here we're saying this kli can be used even after you just be toivel without waiting for nightfall. Tefillah in v'harav shemesh light. In which case, then says the Gemara, our Mishnah, which is requiring only tefillah, must be in accord with the Tana that is not like Masnisan Deloy ki Rebbe Lazar. Our Mishnah must not be like Rebbe Lazar. Now, the Gemara is going to bring a Mishnah in Para. It's actually, I believe, a Mishnah in Para that is also quoted in Yuma. Maybe yeah, maybe no. The Tanan. We're going to see the Mishnah. It's a little bit of a mouthful, so I'll just say it outside. Yeah. So what we're going to see here is there's going to be a machlekes review, Shua and Rebbe Eliezer, and we're going to see that each one of them are referring to mechatos. Now, mechatos is like a very high madrega, but they both say by mechatos. What's the best way to explain this? Yeah. So by mechatos, we have a lot of rules that are unique because we're trying to do something in the halachas of the mechatos to do not like the tzedukim. It's a unique area of halacha, and it's because they have many drushes that we have, that we learned through Torah Shabbal Peh, how the para aduma needs to be done, that the tzedukim didn't hold them. And so therefore their version of now the classic example of the major distinction between the two is a person who is at tvul yom, a person who's gone to the mikvah but still requires some type of kapara. Let's say it's a zav. So he needs harav shemesh. And once he has harav shemesh, then he needs a karbanis the next day. But once he went to the mikvah on day 7, between that point in time to the end of the day, is that person allowed to be osek in the para aduma or not? So we have from drushes, Torah Shabbal Peh teaches us that he can. That the para aduma can be used with a person who's at tvul yom. The tznukim held he can't.
Really?
He has to be someone who's got to have harav shemesh. Yeah.
Is that why they used to touch him?
So one second. So we'll get there. This one step at a time. Yeah. So now, in order to highlight the fact, right? It's like having cholent on Shabbos. We have cholent on Shabbos to show that we hold that you can have a fire as long as you're not lighting it on Shabbos, right? It's la'oitzi miliva cholent. Chamin, the Balmor says, yeah. So to over here, what would we do? We would generally have the person who's at tvul yom. We would have the person who's osik with the mechatas. We would have him specifically become tamei on purpose in order to create a tvul yom. So we would always make sure it's not just simply that we allow a tvul yom, we would make a tvul yom do it. Because we wanted to highlight the fact that that's what we hold, not like the tzdukim who would say we have to only use someone who has had the nightfall come. This is a halach that we did it, and why did we do that? In order to act in a way that was counter to the way the tzdukim did it. It was like highlighting this thing. It's similar to what we saw the other day. That what did we do? We told the Kohen Gadol to dress down a little bit. We told we're going to be maspid on that Sunday when Shavuos falls on Shabbos because we're doing something. We want to be lahotzim milivan shel tzdukim who held that Shavuos is always on Sunday. We needed to do something to make it show that this isn't because of that. So says the Mishnah. Shefayferes, which is a reed of I'm thinking like a bamboo, a big thick bamboo, a big thick piece of bamboo. Shechatcha lechatas that was specifically cut and then fashioned into a kli in order to hold the mechatas.
You made it tell me.
What's that?
You made it tell me.
So Bishlam, that's the Gemara say. Bishlam le Rabbi Yoshua hainu deika heker letzdukin, because he says that by making it tameh, that's very similar to what we do by the mechatas by having a tfil yom do it. The Tanan, like we say now, the Mishnah Gemara quotes the Mishnah that we're discussing, which actually comes up in Yuma. The Tamin hayu es hakoyen. They used to take the kohen who was going to be osik in the parah aduma. They would specifically be matameh him in the rabbanon, and they would do hasoyer fesapar, the one who burnt the parah aduma. They didn't make him. We were okay using someone, not only okay. We specifically used someone who was a tzvul yom lahotzi miliban shel tzdukim mishayu omrim b'urvei shemesh ha'isanasis, because they held it had to be someone who's not a tzvul yom, only someone who had erev shemesh. So like Rabbi Yeshua's din that he holds, you make it tameh first, and only then do you stick it in the mikvah? Will it? Right? Sorry, you go out of your way to make a tummy and then stick it in the mikvah. You have a hecker. Elul Rebbe Lazar. What's the hecker? Says the Gemara. Amris bishlama ba'alma, generally be'in and harav shemesh, she holds you need to wait till nightfall. And now he's saying you don't need to wait till nightfall. Hainu diika heker litzdukim, because there's a deviation.
Even if you don't make a tummy.
Yeah, meaning because he holds you don't make a tummy. Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah argues Rabbi Yeshua says just sticking it in the mikvah. Sticking it in the mikvah without making it tummy, because again, all the tumah is only a tumah derabanan, right? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, what's the hecker for the tzdukin?
You don't want to have shemesh.
So that's the chiddush. If you're going to tell me that in general, then really my heker l'tzdukinika. There's no distinction. So again, what we're saying over here is we're building towards is we're trying to establish that our Mishnah, which is telling us that the halacha is all you need to do is be toivel, that you don't have to wait till nightfall, must be not like Rabbi Eliezer, must be like Rabbi Yoshua, because Rabbi Yoshua is the one who holds you need harav shemesh, right? And since you need harav shemesh, you have a hekera just simply by being metamed, whereas Rabbi Eliezer, who holds you don't need harav shemesh, there's no heker. So it must be he holds you do need harav shemesh, and our Mishnah, which is clearly holding you don't need it, is not like Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says no. La'olam, it could very well be that Rabbi Eliezer holds you do not need harav shemesh, and he's our Mishnah, and all you need is tefillah by the kli. So how do you explain where the heker comes for Rabbi Eliezer over there? Says the Gemara. Rav says, Suha kitame sheretz midirabanan. This whole entire din is a din derabanan, right? We're basically saying that the kli that you're fashioning for out of the concern for the Amoritz, maybe spinning on it, we didn't treat it like a sheni of a zav. We're treating it like a sheretz. We're going to treat it like a sheretz touched it. So therefore, the kli is a kli rishon. It's a rishon l'tumah. Therefore, if it's a rishon l'tumah, that's going to be the unique distinction. Since it's a rishon l'tumah, it's going to be something that's going to require harav shemesh, even according to Rebbe Eliezer, because Rebbe Eliezer is going to hold. The only time he holds you don't need harav shemesh is if you're talking about, let's say, a sheni. But if you're talking about over here where it's an actual something that touched the tumah sheretz, it's the rishon l'tumah, everyone's maskim, you need to go to harav shemesh, and the fact that he's saying you can be toivel without harav shemesh, therefore you have a heker. Ask the Gemara. Once we're discussing that elameata, according to you, what you just established, Rav, that the case of Rebbe Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are talking about is where they made it a rishon l'tumah. Well, elameata loy titma adam. We know that the halacha is the person who fashions that kli also has to go to the mikvah, right? So then how come he has to go to the mikvah? We know that a human being can't become a sheni. And if the keli is a rishon, how does it make him a sheni? Alamatanya, why does it say, the person who cuts this reed and sticks it in a mikvah, ta'un tefillah? Why does he need tefillah? He would only need tefillah if he's tameh. He can't become tameh because he would have to be a sheni. So therefore, says the Gemara, you're right. I didn't mean that they made him like a tumah sheretz, someone who touched a sheretz. They didn't make the kli like a kli that touched the sheretz. They made the kli a kli that touched the tumas mace. What's the benefit of that? The mace is an aviyavos tumah. So now the kli becomes an avatuma. Well, now the person who's touching the avatuma, now all of a sudden he would be a rishon. Says the Gemara, ihachi tiboy hazas shlishi ushvi. So here there's different mahalchim in the Gemara, but I'm going to explain it the way I understood it. What we're saying is that the kli should require 3 and 7 day spritzing from the mechatas, because now it's an avatuma, it's tamei mace. So then alama tanya, how come it says chatchu matbila ton tefila in hazah shlishu shvila? You see in the version of Bryce that it doesn't require that. So if it doesn't require that extra stuff, and according to you, it's an avatuma of tamei mace, it should require it. So the Gemara explains finally, no. When the rabbi said we're going to consider it like a special type of tumah, it's elish asua ketame mace v'shvi shalai. They were very specific. We're treating it like a tamei mace that came into contact with a dead body that has already had it spritzing on the 3rd day, on the 7th day. So it's a tumas mace. It's still an av. It makes the person a rishon, so he needs to go into the mikvah. But it does not require hazah, and therefore that's the case. And what are we saying? Everyone agrees that those things typically require harav shemesh. Not only harav shemesh, they need a carbon the next day, right? Meaning midirabanan, we're giving it that status, and comes along. You're good to go. That's going to be the deviation. But la'olam, we could say our Mishnah fits with Rebbe Eliezer, because our Mishnah is saying you don't need harav shemesh, and Rebbe Eliezer in general by Kalim also says you don't need harav shemesh. So it comes out you're creating this really wacky din. You're basically saying that when a person fashions a kli that is going to be used for mechatas, the tumah that we give it is a tumah that is like like a dead body touched it, but only a dead body that has already touched it, and the kli has already received spritzes on day 3 and day 7. Very, very, the lashon of Rashi here is ein chiddush gadol mizeh. This is a tremendous chiddush, and we have a general rule that when it comes to hilchas mechatas, ba'olam lechidshu davar bepara, we don't generally try not to be mechadish nu halachas. So Amar Abaye, no. When do we mean when we say that by hilchas para, by hilchas mechatas, we don't like to be mechadish nu halachas? What we mean is we don't like to say something that is counter to. We don't like to say it's something that cannot become tamei can become tamei. We don't like to be mechadish new halachas that way. But to come up with new tziurim or chumras or whatever it is, that we'll do all day. Says the Gemara, what do we mean when we say that in Hilchas Mechatas or Hilchas Para, we don't want to be mechadish? What we mean to say is that normally Tumas Medras only applies to things that are normally sat on, a cushion, a chair, a shoe. But we're not going to take a shovel. Let's say a person decides to sit on a shovel as a zav. Does that become Tamei Tumas Medras, Tumas Moshav? No, of course not. So what are you going to say? You're going to say that no, for Mechatas we'll be machmir to do it for that we're not going to be mechadish nu halachas. Meaning we don't take something that cannot become tamei and make it tamei. It says the Gemara Kedetanya, like it says in the Brisa. This is that halacha. V'hayoshev ala kli. A person sits on a kli. Yachol kappa saw. Let's say you flip over like a bucket, or you flip over a crate, or you flip over some type of kli that holds a saw of grain. V'yashav ala, and you sit on it. Or a tarka, which is also a kli, holds like half a saw. V'yashav aleh, you might think havamina yehi tamei. Maybe it should be tamei if a zav sits on that, because it should be tamei tumas moshav. Meaning those things are not things that are normally sat on. A milk crate is used for carrying milk. It's not used for sitting. Some people might use it to sit on, but it's not a chair. No one would say, "Here, I bought you a chair." They would say, "Thank you for the milk crate." Yeah. Talmud. So how do I know that if a zav sits on that, it's not going to be tamei? Like the pasuk says, "V'hayoshev al kli asher yoshev olav yitma." What do we understand from here? The lashon of Yoshev teaches us mishim yuchad liyeshiva, only a kli that is normally sat on. Yotzezeh sha'imrim lo yamod. We would tell such a person, if he's sitting on the milk crate, get off of it. V'nasim l'lachteno, let us fill it with milk and go do our job. Meaning the point is this kli is not something you normally sit on. Therefore, it's not mekabel tumas moshav. That is something we're not going to be mechadish in para. But la'olam, we have no problem creating new fangled dinim derabanan, even if it means grabbing a tamei mace that touched the kli, and it's as if the kli has already received its third day and seventh day spritz. I know we're moving fast here, but
the spit or not spit, do they make a bracha at the total because it's a kasha?
I'm not sure. If it's only a tumah derabanan, when you're toivel l'chara, you wouldn't make a bracha. Yeah, I would assume.
Okay, I have to go because
You have to go? All right, I'm gonna continue because I want to cover some ground.
What can you do?
I'm not sure. It depends on how long I lose comment.
We have to know. We have to know.
Yeah, I'll tell you exactly. It'll probably be the two dots over here.
You know, all the way down to the
Yeah, it goes pretty. This Gemara is very fast Gemara.
Sure.
That's why I want to do it now, so that way when we start, whatever.
Okay.
Okay.
Show me where again? What does that with?
Chav daled without two dots ubetruma.
Okay.
I'll take a picture of it and send it to the chat, so that way you can see it.
What do you mean? Oh, true.
I mean, Okay, says the Gemara weiter. You good? We're gonna go weiter? You okay? Okay. Now, I know we're moving a little fast, but I feel like it's beneficial for weiter. Yeah. Okay.
It's a very hard one.
What's that?
Very hard. This.
Yeah. Listen, the Tumatara stuff in general is hard, and
No, it's not. But I'm just.
No.
These subjects just seem,
Hmm.
very hard for me. So I'm waiting for the next one.
If you want, maybe on Shabbos. We'll take a couple extra minutes, maybe try to find some time.
Yeah,
We can go over some things if you have any questions. Okay. Says the Gemara weiter, two dots. It said in the Mishnah that if I have a kli, if I have a vessel, and that vessel contains within it a bunch of different items. Let's say one of those items is tamei. Do we say the other items inside the kli are tamei or not? Do we say that all of the items in the kli sort of take on the din of any one of those items because they're all collected inside that one vessel? Or no, do we say they're distinct and separate? Right? We're not talking here about tarobas like kashrus, like a flour mixing with flour or liquid with liquid. Let's have apples in a bowl. One of the apples is tamei. So do we say, now remember, the rule by food is that ochlin and mashkim can become tamei only to a sheni, right? If it's chulin. If it's truma, it can become a shlishi. If it's hegdish, it can become a revi. So it says in the Mishnah, let's say I have a vessel, and that
Like it goes like this, or just like a plate.
I'm thinking of like a bowl. I mean,
A bowl.
Yeah, a bowl.
Okay.
So I have a bowl that sort of incorporates everything together inside the kli. So it said in the Mishnah, "Hakli mitzaref masha besochel kodesh." For when it becomes hegdish related stuff, we treat everything that's inside of it as if it becomes tamei. Avaloi l'truma, which is very interesting. But we're basically, and again, it makes sense. Meaning, what is let's say you have a person who's a rishon. He can't make a kli tamei. You can't make a kli tamei unless it comes into contact with an avatum, right? And even if it comes into contact with an avatuma, the kli is only a rishon, which means it will make everything that's inside it a sheni. So that'll work. But unless it's coming into contact with an avatuma, if it only comes into contact with, let's say, a rishon latuma, you can't make a kli a sheni. And since you can't make a kli a sheni, everything that's inside of it is not going to become tamei from the kli. The only way everything that's inside of it will become tamei is if, let's say, someone took something tamei, put it in the kli. Now, I have something in the kli that's tamei. Let's say it's a sheni. So that piece of food, let's say the apple that's a sheni, touches the apple next to it, that apple becomes a shlishi. So for truma, that's the end of the line. If there's 10 apples, only 2 of the apples are going to become tamei. The next apple's not going to be a problem. So that's going to be a revi. There's no revi by truma. For hegdish, the third apple will be a problem. But even for hegdish, that'll be the end of the line because you can only have revi. You can't have a mishi and a shishi and a shvi. So therefore, apple number 4 won't be tamei, and if there's 10 apples, the rest of them will be tahar. However, says the Mishnah for hegdish, there's no limit. We're going to treat all of the apples as if they're tamei, but not truma. So ask the Gemara, where's this halacha from? Now you'll notice that in our entire Mishnah, we've always been discussing tumas or distinctions between kodesh and truma that are derabanan, not min haTorah. And here it says the Gemara, minani mili, where do we know this halacha? Amar Rav Chanan. Rav Chanan says the Amar Kra, it's a pasuk, meaning we're coming from a pasuk, which means what Rav Chanan is saying is that this din is a din Torah, it's a din deraisa. What's the pasuk? Pasuk says by the korbanos that we brought in the Mishnah, we brought every type of carbon. It says kaf achas asara zahav milea ketoris. Literally, it means 1 spoon, 10 pieces of gold, right? Milea ketoris, filled with ketoris, filled with incense, filled with the carbon ketoris. So it's kaf achas. It's 1 spoon. Now, what do I need the word achas for? The word kaf. Kaf means a spoon. It's 1 spoon. So it must be the word achas is extra. What is it coming to teach me? Akasav asuhu lekol masha bekaf. The Torah is treating everything that is inside that spoon achas, like 1. Meaning, this is a special xeris akasav that tells us that the kli that is used to hold kodesh makes everything that's inside of it going to be together. So if one of the things is tamei, all of the things are tamei. That's the shita of Rav Chanan, that this din of our Mishnah, different than all other 10 items, is a din deraisa, whereas the rest of them are din of derabanan. Now, ask the Gemara, how can you tell me it's a din deraisa? Masiv, Rav Kahana asks a kasha from the following din Mishnah in Adiyos. In Masechta Adiyos, you have a lot of disparate halachas, really unconnected in terms of topic. They're just specific cases where people made an edus. They testified about something. The thing they testified was halacha, so therefore the entire Masechta talks about things. Well, one of the things that's talked about over there is this halacha. Says the Gemara, Hoisif Rabbi Akiva added, which means we're missing some context, right? Anytime someone starts a conversation with the word and, means you missed the first sentence, right? So what happened before? So Rashi tells us, if you take a look at Rashi, third to last skinny line, Hoisif Rabbi Akiva, Reisha, the beginning of this Mishnah, Ketani says the following. Heyed Reb Shimon said the following testimony. I'll offer chatas, on the offer of a chatas, on the ashes of a chatas, like paraduma. Shenogat tamei b'miktsasai pasul eskulei. So the first half of the Mishnah says that if someone who's tamei touches the mei chatas, or the offer of a chatas, the ash of a burnt paraduma, if he touches only part of it, it extends into the entire thing, extends it. Now, that din has to be a din derabanan, because if according to Rav Chanan, what's the drasha? The drasha comes from the ketoris. Ketoris is a carbon that goes into the Beis HaMikdash. It's burnt up on an altar. The din Torah could only be referring to those things that are brought up as karbanos, because that's what the Torah is talking about. The ash of the chatas is not a carbon. It's something we use in a purification process. For something, it's tamei meis. You don't bring it up as a carbon. So even the mechatas, even though mechatas is holier, it's not a carbon. Since it's not a carbon, it can't be learnt out from the pasuk that Rav Chanan quoted, which means by definition, the beginning of this Mishnah is talking about a din derabanan. And Rabbi Akiva is saying, and not only that, but I'll even add some things onto it, which means he's adding on to the first thing. Well, if the first thing was a din derabanan, then everything he's adding must be a din derabanan. That's what the Gemara is going to say. Masiv Rav Kahana, hostif Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva added on the following 2 mechatas to the ash of the chatas, to the ash of the paraduma. He added soles, flour, which is the flour used in a carbon mincha, the haktores, the incense, which is the carbon ketores, the halavoina, which I think is in English is frankincense, which is also, that's part of the mincha, the hagechalim, which Rishonim have a hard time understanding what the coals are referring to. Some say it's referring to the coals that are used like in Kippur. I'm not exactly sure, but the point is Rabbi Akiva added all of these to the first statement. The first statement was that the ash of the that is used to purify a tamei meis by para aduma, if someone who's tamei touched part of it, it's the tumah goes throughout everything. It's collected inside the kli to make everything tamei. And Rabbi Akiva added on the flour, the incense, the frankincense, and the coals also have that same halacha. She'im noga tvul yom b'miktzah. So if a person who is tamei tvul yom touches part of it, pasal es kulo. So Rabbi Akiva is clearly talking about the din of our Mishnah. What does the din of our Mishnah say? That if I have hegdish in a bowl and only part of it became touched by a person who's tamei, the din of our Mishnah says that for hegdish, all of it becomes tamei. And Rabbi Chanan said, where's that learned from? Min HaTorah. That's a drasha. Yet Rabbi Akiva is clearly talking about a din derabanan, and he's describing our Mishnah. So clearly Rabbi Akiva is holding it's derabanan, and the Gemara proves it. The haderabanani. How do I know it's derabanan? Mimai Mendiktani Reishef. If you look at the beginning of that Mishnah, which we already read in Rashi, hey, Reb Shimon ben Beseira. Reb Shimon ben Beseira said the following edus: Al offer chatas, the ash of a para aduma, which is not hegdish in the classic sense. It's not going to go up on the mizbeach. Right, it's not a carbon. He already said that halacha. Ukatani hosef Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is adding on to that, which means the statement of Rabbi Akiva was only in addition to what was already stated. And if what was already stated was a din derabanan, then Rabbi Akiva is only discussing a din derabanan, and he's describing our Mishnah. So A plus B and B plus C, A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. If Rabbi Akiva, if the Tanakama is talking about a din derabanan, and Rabbi Akiva is talking about the Tanakama, and he's also talking about a din derabanan, well, if he's talking about a din derabanan, and I read his words, he's describing the din of our Mishnah, then ipso facto, our Mishnah is a din derabanan, and how could Rabbi Chanan say it comes from a deraisa? Reish Lakish, he says no. Mishum bar kapara, he says la'olam, you could say that Rabbi Akiva is talking about a din derabanan, and he's adding on top of the din Torah, meaning lo nitzricha elo l'shiari mincha, meaning la'olam dimidaraisa tzarich lekli hakli mitzarfo shein tzarich lekli ein kli mitzarfo. The olam the halach is that when is the din of our Mishnah true? Min haTorah. When do I need a pasuk to teach me that everything that's inside the kli is going to become tamei? When the item that's in there needs a kli, meaning if it's an item that's going up as a carbon. So ketores is something that needs a kli. Lavono will be something which needs a kli, so we'll get to that in a second. But the din of our Mishnah is talking about regular, normal hegdish, which needs a kli. Whereas soles, the flour, although it normally needs a kli if it's being used for a mincha, what Rabbi Akiva is teaching us is even the leftover soles. Now here you have to sort of know a little bit how a mincha is brought up. Mitzvah Shem will get to when we learn menachos. But the way a mincha is brought up, it's a flour offering. They would take flour. The Kohen would stick his hand in the flour. He would take out a certain amount, and he would hold it in between these three fingers like this. And then he would take his pinky and his thumb, and he would wipe off the sides.
In Yomi, right?
Yes, exactly where it comes up. And then what's left over, he would take that over to the altar, and he would basically do something called hagasha, which means he'd put it on the mizbeach, and then it would get burnt.
That's hard to do, by the way.
Not hard. Yeah, no, it's hard. Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to have dexterity. Yeah. What do you mean? The other thing, how do you think they shech the bird with the thumb? They used to cut the neck of the bird with the nail on the thumb. Yeah.
Really?
I don't know if it was with the nail or they had a special cleat. But the point is that so this mincha, right? So there would be a lot of leftover flour after they would do the carbon, because all this is called kemitza, by the way. This process. It's supposed to be the equivalent of like shchita in an animal carbon, right? So it's an avoda. It's an important avoda in the carbon of a mincha. But there'd be a lot of, just like an animal carbon, there's a lot of leftover meat. So, and it needs to be burnt up or eaten by the kohanim or whatever it is. So too with a meal offering, a mincha, there'd be a lot of leftover flour. What do we do with that leftover flour? It's hegdish. So the halacha is it has to either be consumed by the kohanim or it needs to be burnt or whatever it is. It needs to be addressed. You can't just leave it over.
Could anyone do that? Like anyone could do shkita, right?
Shchita anyone could do. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if anyone could do kemitza. I think kemitza might only be able to be done by a kain. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure about that. It's a good question. So what is Rabbi Akiva telling us? Rabbi Akiva is saying that the din Torah, which applies only to those things that require a kli, meaning the kemet, what's actually part of the carbon, this leftover flour doesn't require a kli. It's not considered a chelik of the avoda. Therefore, only midirabanan do we say that if a tful yom touched it, does the entire thing become tamei? Minat Torah, it wouldn't. So it's not that Rabbi Akiva is arguing that the entire din is a din derabanan. He's saying the din is a din deraisa. He's just coming to say that midirabanan we expanded the din Torah. But la'olam you could always say that it comes from a pasuk like Rav Chanan said, and he's just talking about the flour that is the additional flour, and that is midirabanan. The asur rabbanan v'gazur, the rabbis came and made a gzeira specifically on that added flour. So the Gemara says the afal gav de'eno tzarich lekli kli mitzarfo, that even though it doesn't need the kli pulls it together. And again, without getting too detailed over here in the lumdus of it, but think of it this way: if the whole reason why if I touch one thing in the kli, it makes everything else tamei, is because we look at the kli as like bringing everything inside of it together, right? Well, wouldn't it be logical to conclude that that is only going to be true if everything that's in that kli halachically needs to be in that kli? But what if I told you something just found its way into that kli, but it doesn't halachically need to be there? Maybe you'd say that that doesn't become tummy because maybe the tumah isn't just simply from it being in the receptacle of the kli. It's specifically because halachically it needs to be there in order for the avodah, meaning for the carbon. For the carbon, yeah. So since it needs to be put into the kli for the avodah, I don't need to take the leftover stuff and put it in a bowl. The only stuff that goes in the bowl is the stuff that's going to go onto the mizbeach. All this leftover stuff doesn't require in the bowl. So if it finds its way into a bowl, or if it's sitting in a kli that's used for hegdish, should it become tameh also? Maybe not. Maybe only. So says the Gemara. Min HaTorah, only those things that require a kli become tameh this way. Mid'Rabbanan, we said even things that don't require a kli. But Lo'elam Rabbi Akiva, when he said that it's going to become tameh, he is talking about a din d'Rabbanan, but it's not a contradiction to Reb Chanan, who said that there's also a din Torah. Gemara says, okay, fine. Tenach solas. You've explained the case of Rabbi Akiva when he talks about flour. Ketoras v'levona ma'ikal ameimar. Ketoras and levona, those are things that require a kli. Ketoris is mamish the ketoris. It goes on the mizbeach. It needs to be brought in a kli over to the mizbeach and burnt. Same thing with the levina when you're doing the mincha. That is part of the avodah of the carbon mincha. That's not extra stuff. So Rabbi Akiva also said that, which means he's clearly talking about those items that lechora require a kli, and therefore, according to what we're saying now, Rabbi Akiva is referring to them as an issa derabanan or as a tumah derabanan. But really, according to Reb Chanan, those things should be tamei min hatayra. So I'm Rav Nachman, I'm a Rabbi Baravu. You're right. It's kingoin shetzibron al gabe kartavla. The case is specifically talking about where Rabbi Akiva is saying where you put the levona and you put the ketoras on a kli that does not have a receptacle. It's like a flat piece of hard leather that is used to carry. Think of like a platter versus, let's say, a bowl, right? And therefore, since it doesn't have like a receptacle to it, doesn't have what's referred to as a toich. Since it doesn't have a toich, although it can be used to take for the avodas in the Beis Hamikdash, but for this halacha of saying that it makes everything inside of it tameh, it only is going to be tameh if the kli also happens to have a toch, a receptacle. And again, it makes sense. If the pasuk is teaching me the halacha, what does the halacha refer to? It refers to as a kaf. That's a spoon. A spoon has a toch. Makes sense to say that the tumah is going to this din is going to be exactly like the Torah says, a spoon filled with ketairos. So kartavla, the araisa yesh le'toich mitzaref, because min Torah, if it has a receptacle, it takes everything inside of it and makes it tameh. Ein le'toich, but if it has no receptacle, then eino mitzaref, it doesn't connect everything together. When the rabbis came along and made a takana, the afagav the ein lo toch, this kartavla, this piece of leather that's just flat, which min Torah really would not make everything that's on top of it tameh. Mitzaref does midrabanan do it. That's what Rabbi Akiva is telling me. A din derabanan, but he's only adding a din derabanan onto an already existent deraisa, which would fit Rav Chanan.
Because that's what Rav Chanan said.
Yes, right? It's deraisa because of Rav Chanan, and these dinim of Rabbi Akiva, which we were medayik correctly, he's only talking about dinim derabanan. Why is he only talking about dinim derabanan? Must be he holds the whole din is derabanan. No. He agrees, of course, with Rav Chanan that it's a deraisa. He's just adding additional halachas miderabanan like this. The solus is because it's the extra solus, the levona, and the ketoris is because it's talking about where it was on a flat kli. But ain't a chanami. If it would be on a regular kli like a spoon or a bowl, then of course it would be, and then it would even be min haTorah. So says the Gemara that this statement of Rav Chanan that holds that the din of our mission is a din min haTorah upliga the Rav Chanan adirab Chia bar Abba. He argues with Reb Chia bar Abba because Reb Chia bar Abba is going to say it's a derabanan. Why? How do we see that Reb Chia bar Abba holds that our din of our mission is a din derabanan? I mean, he doesn't hold to the drasha. The Amr Reb Chia bar Abba, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, may a duso shall Rabbi Akiva nishnas mishnazu. He understands that our Mishnah was only taught after Rabbi Akiva's edus, meaning our Mishnah is the din of Rabbi Akiva. There is no prior din Torah that Rabbi Akiva is adding on to, but rather our Mishnah itself wouldn't have been taught, or at least the part of the Mishnah we're discussing, would not have been taught had Rabbi Akiva not said his halacha. Meaning what? Our Mishnah is a din derabanan. Because Rabbi Akiva was talking about a din derabanan. What's the derabanan? The derabanan is that even if it's got a receptacle, it's a din derabanan. Even if it's something that requires a kli, that's only midirabanan. And our Mishnah is talking about a din derabanan. So it'll come out that it's a machlekes amirayim whether the din of our Mishnah is deraisa derabanan, like Rav Chanan it's a deraisa, like Reb Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, it's a din derabanan, And depending upon who you're talking to, they'll read Rabbi Akiva and Adias different ways. We'll just learn one more Gemara and then we'll hold it for the day. Says the Gemara Weiler. It said in the Mishnah, Haravi bekodesh pasal. We said there's a very unique distinction between Truma and Kodesh. Truma can only become a Shlishi, cannot become a Revi, but Kodesh could even become a Revi. That's another Maila that Hegdish has over Truma. And like we said before, that whenever Truma transfers, it drops a level, right? It goes from an Av to a Rishon, from a Rishon, Sheni, Shlishi to a Revi. Says the Gemara, Tanya Arbav Yosi, Minayin l'Revi bekodesh pasal. How do we know this then? How do I know that it's true that you could make a Revi for a Kodesh? Meaning I see you can make a Rishon, you can make a Sheni, Truma is a Shlishi. How do I know that for Kodesh, there's Hegdish, there's this Maila of it can even go to Revi? Gemara says it's the Kavachimer. What's the Kavachimer? Revidinhu. Uma mechusar kippurim, which we explained before, is a person, let's say a Zav, or a Nida, whatever it is, who is Tameh, who requires the mikvah. After the mikvah, they're at full yom, then nighttime comes, now they're in mechusar kippurim, they wake up in the morning, they bring a carbon. So that night, what is that person allowed to eat? Truma. He's allowed to have truma, right? He can't have hegdish yet, but he can have truma. Uma mechusar kippurim, shemuter b'truma, because at night, right, he's allowed to have truma already, and yet, pasal b'kodesh, he's not allowed to have hegdish. Right, shlishi, a person who is a something that's a shlishi l'tama, shepasul b'truma, a person who is a kohen cannot eat truma if the truma has become a shlishi. Right, we know that truma can become a shlishi. Right, so shlishi is more chamer than a mechusar kippurim. As a source of tuma, a shlishi is higher than a mechusar kippurim because a mechusar kippurim eat truma, and a shlishi makes truma a problem. Meaning, so when it interacts with truma, mechusar kippurim is lower because you're okay having truma, whereas a shlishi can you can't eat a shlishi if it's a what do you call it? If truma comes in contact with a sheni, it makes it a shlishi. The truma is going to become usher to eat. A kohen cannot interact with a shlishi of truma, but he can interact as a mechusar kippurim with truma. So which one's more chamer? Clearly, the din tuma shlishi. Says the Gemara. If you're going to tell me that the mechusar kippurim that's allowed to have truma can't have hegdish, cannot interact with hegdish. So then certainly a shlishi, which when a kohen interacts with it, it's usher. Certainly it can't come into contact with hegdish. Meaning if it comes into contact with hegdish, it makes it tummy. That's the way the Gemara understands it. It's a kal v'chaymer. V'dinu. Uma mechusar kippurim shemuter b'truma pasal b'kodesh shlishi shepasal b'truma eino din sheya'aser revi l'kodesh. Meaning there's a kal v'chaymer. The kal v'chaymer basically establishes that hegdish can become a revi l'tum. So the Gemara says, fine. V'lamadnu shlishi l'kodesh min haTorah u'revi mikal v'chomer. So we established the kal v'chomer. Says the statement of the Gemara. I know that hegdish can become a shlishi. That's a pasuk, and I know that it can become a revi from a kal v'chomer. So says the Gemara, shlishi l'kodesh min haTorah minayin. You've established the kal v'chomer, but where do you know that it can become a shlishi min haTorah? Says the Gemara, it's a pasuk. Tichsev v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yeyachel, and the meat that touches in all of Tameh, lo yayachel, it should not be eaten. Says the Gemara, milei askinon, the naga b'sheni. Rashi over here explains why, but without getting too far into the details, the lashon of the pasuk of Tameh implies we're talking about a sheni l'tuma. The kamer achmana lo yayachel, you shouldn't eat it. So, which is mashma that what you see that when kodesh becomes a shlishi, it can become a shlishi that you're not allowed to eat it. Revi mikal v'chaymer, that's from had the amr like we explained in the Gemara before. We'll hold over here by the two dots. I know it's fast, I know it's a lot of ground, but I really feel for you, Yomi. It's going to be helpful.
Good. We need to do it. Yeah.